The last part of making your quilt is putting binding all the way around the edge. This is what seals in the layers and can give it a nice border. So that's what I'm talking about today. Welcome to Epida Studio. My name is Elizabeth and I help you make beautiful things with quilting, pajargi, and embroidery. So once you've finished the quilting, stitching all the layers together, then the last step we have is putting the binding on our quilt. So that's what I'm talking about today. I'm going to take you through the steps on this quilt that we've been making, the simple rail fence quilt. So the first thing we're going to want to do is trim away this excess, the excess batting and backing that we have. And so to do that, you want to lay it flat on a table, and then you're just going to cut it off. And you can cut it either with scissors or with a rotary cutter and ruler. It doesn't really matter, but you just want to cut it so that the edge lines up with the edge of your top piece. So you might see places where the batting and the backing has shifted and it's not exactly the same size as it was when we were basting them together. And so you'll find out that's why we can't cut it the exact size to start off with. Because if we cut it the exact size, then if there was any shifting, suddenly our backing fabric would be too small. And so you want to cut it bigger, and now at this stage, we're going to cut off the excess. So that's the first thing you're going to do. The next thing you want to do is calculate how much of a binding strip of fabric you need. So to calculate how many binding strips we need to do a little bit of math. And so I'm going to show you how I calculate this for my simple rail fence quilt, but this would be the same procedure you would do with any quilt. You would just use the numbers that go along with that. And so the quilt I made was 5 blocks by 7 blocks. So that means the dimensions of the finished quilt are 45 inches by 63 inches. And I do encourage you, lay your quilt out flat and actually measure it with a ruler, because sometimes it won't turn out exactly the size that it says in the pattern. But once you've measured the sides, then you're going to know that you want the total of all the sides, the perimeter of the piece. Then we're also going to need a little bit extra for the corners and for where your strips overlap. So I like to add about 20 inches for that, because that gives me about 4 inches for the overlap and 4 inches for each of the corners. So if I add 45, 45, 63, 63, and 20, I'm going to end up with 236 inches, because the perimeter is 216, and then I'll add another 20. Now, interestingly, if I had done the 6 by 6 quilt layout, it would have been 54 inches square, and in that case, I would have been the same. 54 inches square is 216, and then plus 20 would be 236. So that would be the same perimeter for either one of those quilts. Now 236, that's how long of a piece we want to go all the way around the border of our quilt. And since we know that strips are about 40 inches long, we can think 236, we will need 6 strips, because if they're 40 inches, then 6 strips will give us 240. So that's close to what we want. We cannot round down for this. If we had measured it and we found that we needed 250 inches, we can't say, oh, well, if we round off 240 inches, because you need that extra 10 inches. You can't round down, you have to round up. So we're going to want 6 strips of fabric. Now for our fabric, there are a couple of different ways that you can cut fabric. And if you read some older quilting books, you might see it recommended that you cut bias strips. So they're cut on the diagonal grain of the fabric. And there's nothing wrong with cutting diagonal strips. It is more complicated to do. And the advantage of that is then you have threads on the cross grain, and so it's not as much wear and tear on a single row of threads. However, if this is your first quilt project, there's no need to cut on the diagonal. You can cut fabric on the straight of grain and it will still turn out great. So when you go on, if you're doing more complex things, if you're doing quilts that have curved edges on them or scallops, then you will need bias. But for your first project, you don't need bias. Just cut your strips on the straight of grain, just the same way as we cut our strips for making the quilt top. So we're gonna want 6 strips. Now, how wide do we need to cut them? This is a little bit of a personal choice, but most people go around 2 1/4 inches or 2 1/2 inches. I personally cut my strips 2 1/4 inches, but if you try that and it seems too narrow, if you're having trouble with it, then feel free to cut them to 2 1/2 inches. That's what most quilters are, somewhere in that range. So try 2 1/4, but if you like 2 1/2 better, then feel free to use that. So we have all these strips. We want to join these together on the ends so it makes a continuous piece that's long enough to go around our quilt. So to join these pieces, we don't want to join them with a straight seam like this. We want to join them with a diagonal seam. And that will help eliminate some of the bulk when we're pinning it on and sewing it onto the quilt. We won't have seams overlapping. It will offset the seams, and you'll see what I mean by that when we are sewing it on. So to join them together, you're gonna place your 2 ends right sides together, but at right angles. So you're making a little L here, and then you're gonna stitch right on the diagonal from this corner to this corner. And you can either eyeball it, or you can actually draw that line right on there and stitch right on that line. We're gonna stitch that from corner to corner. Once we've stitched that, then we're just gonna trim it away about 1/4 inch. You can eyeball this. This does not have to be exact. And I'm gonna trim off those corners. And then we can press that. I'll press that seam to one side and we can see that we have a strip. So we're gonna do that with all 6 of our strips, join them so we have one really long continuous piece. When it's joined together and we have our long piece, now we're gonna go to the ironing board and we're gonna press it in half the long ways with the right sides out. So we're pressing the wrong sides together. So we're gonna end up with a piece that is half as wide, but we see the right side of the fabric on both sides. So once we've trimmed all the edges and we've made our long piece, folded in half, we're ready to start sewing it onto our quilt. And there are 2 different ways that we can do this. And there's no better way or worse way. There's no right and wrong answer, but it kind of depends how much you like hand stitching and if you're comfortable with your stitches showing up. So the first way, and I'm just going to explain this, is you will put your binding piece on the front of your quilt. So you're aligning the raw edges with the edge of the quilt, and then you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, and I'll show you how we sew that around. And then once it's sewn on, we're gonna fold this around. So this is stitched on this side, and we'll fold that around to the back, and then we will hand stitch this part down on the back. Now the advantage with this technique is you can't see any stitching lines. This stitching line is on the inside, and on the back, that stitching line will be hidden because it's hand stitched. And a lot of people really enjoy hand stitching their binding down, especially in the winter. They can watch a movie and cuddle under a quilt as they're hand stitching, and they really like the clean finish that it gives. But I'm going to show you how you can do the whole thing on a sewing machine. So it's machine stitched down, and we're going to start off in the same way sewing our binding strip onto the quilt, except we're going to put it on the reverse side of the quilt. So we're going to sew it on this side, and then we're going to be folding it over and do the second row of stitching on the front of the quilt. And so I'm going to demonstrate this sewing it onto the back of the quilt, but if you want to do it the first way, you'll do it the same, but you'll stitch on the front of the quilt. Now for stitching this on, it can be helpful if you have some of these little clips. They're like mini little clothespins. If you don't have any of these, you could also use clothespins. You could use bulldog clips, some kind of clip, but because this is really thick, it's hard to get pins to hold it in. And some people will clip this all the way around their whole quilt before they start. I don't do that. I tend to clip a little bit and then move the clips as I sew. So I'll use 3 or 4 clips, and I'll put on about 12 or 18 inches, and then I'm just gonna start sewing. So I'm clipping this onto the back of the quilt, and then I'm gonna start sewing, but I'm leaving a little tail. I'm not gonna start sewing right at the end. I'm gonna leave about 3 or 4 inches, start sewing here, and then sew right through all the layers to sew this binding onto the quilt. So for this sewing, we're gonna want about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but I'm gonna just use the width of my presser foot. So that's a tiny bit less than 1/4 inch, but if your presser foot is close to 1/4 of an inch, you can use that, or you can use a 1/4 inch foot. If your foot is significantly wider, then you don't want to go with that, but close to 1/4 of an inch is good enough. So now I'm just going to start stitching. And just making sure that everything stays lined up. And as I go, I can just move the clips along so that the next 7 or 8 inches are held on with clips. Now when I'm coming up to the corner, this is the only part that's a little bit tricky. So I'm gonna come up and stop about 1/4 of an inch before this edge of the quilt. And I'm gonna leave the needle down, and I will lift the foot, and I'm just gonna rotate this, and I'm gonna sew right off of the corner. So I'll put the foot back down, and sew right off the corner. So then I'm going to cut the thread so we can see that I have this little kind of hockey stick shape. It comes down and goes off the corner. So now I'm going to fold this back this way on a diagonal line, and I'll just kind of finger press that, and then fold it back this way. So I folded it to the right and then folded it back to the left. So you can see this is what it looks like. And now I'm going to turn this. I'll put a clip in here to help hold it. And I'll turn the quilt, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to start sewing here, right in this spot, not at the edge. I'll start sewing about 1/4 of an inch down and then stitch along. And I'm going to do a couple of back stitches just to help hold it in place. And now I'm going to continue sewing down this side, and when I get to the other corners, I'll do those in just the same way. So once we've come around, we're almost back to where we started. We just have this little section to go. Now I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to cut that on a diagonal And if you're more comfortable, you can do this even before you sew it on. But it doesn't have to be exact 45 degrees, but pretty close. And then I'm going to fold that over with about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to finger press that. So now we have a clean edge here, and then as we sew, we're going to sew and then we're going to lay this section into here so it overlaps. And then I'm going to trim this. So I want to trim it so that there's lots of overlap. I want to make sure it's inside. So this will be in there. This is a little bit long. So this will be like that. I'll put a pin. I'll put a clip to hold that. So now you can see one end has gone inside the other end. That edge is folded over, so it's nice and flat. And now I'm just going to stitch. So once this is stitched onto the reverse side, now I'll flip it over, and on the front side I can fold this over, and we can see we have a clean edge because this is the fold of our binding. And now I'm going to come along and top stitch this to hold it down. So I want to stitch right along the edge of this. So I'll show you how to do that. I'll show you what it looks like in the corners. There are a couple of options. If you're having a hard time getting straight stitching to stay, you can feel free to do a decorative stitch or a zigzag stitch. That'll make it easier to get the edge of the fabric, and it'll give it a little fancy look to it. Or if you don't want any stitching to show, then you can always hand stitch this. So it's up to you how much you want these stitches to show and be dominant, or how much you want them to be invisible. So just take your time and go slow. And when you get up to the corner, you're going to fold it like that. So it's going straight down, and then fold this edge back. And we can see it gives a little mitered corner right there. I'm going to put a clip to hold that. Put a clip to hold this side. And then when you get close, we'll have to take the clip out, but just hold it with your fingers. And I like to do a little back stitch in the corners. And then I'll leave the needle down. I'll lift the presser foot, turn it, and then I'm going to do another couple back stitches. And then I can continue sewing down here. And then this is what the corner looks like. And then sometimes you're lucky and you get a perfect mitered corner. Sometimes it's a little bit wonky, but it'll get better with practice. So once you put the binding on, now your quilt is finished. Congratulations on making your first quilt. If you're looking for more quilt patterns, ideas, and tutorials, you can find all that at my website, epidastudio.com.